destroyed by the forest department. So why should the tribals regenerate it? That is the basic point. And my only thing is, if the tribals are ensured that they would get the benefits from this, whatever they regenerate, they would be interested in regenerating it. And bamboo gives a big, although under Forest Rights Act you don't have any right over teak and other main forest produce. Bamboo is included in minor forest produce, and bamboo itself can give tremendous amount of income. You should see and meet the tribals, and they know everything. You don't have to teach them silviculture of bamboo. They know the silviculture of bamboo best. They know which bamboo to cut, which not to cut, how to allow it to regenerate, and what to do when the seeding has happened. Everything they know. So you just ensure them that whatever bamboo you grow, you can sell it to any company or anybody at your own price, and forest department and governments would not have any say in that, then they would do that. They are looking forward to it.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a question on the back.
My question is in the context of environmental Banchi ban. Ma'am, when the judiciary is confronted with the issue of environment and project, and their implementation is, on the other hand, gave foster the process of development. On the other hand, their implementation would devastate the environment. So on what way should judiciary go? I mean, what are the points, on what grounds do judiciary choose to go in a way, whatever, is it their implementation or not?
Does anybody want to attempt answering this?
Yeah.
I think at the very least, rule of law should be followed. At the very least. What is happening in most of these cases is rule of law is being flouted, and what is coming up is personal biases about development and prosperity and what is good for the area. Follow the rule of law, at least at the minimum, stick to that. And if you actually follow many of these cases, that exactly is what is being flouted. And of course, anybody else can add. This is just...
No, good, yeah.
Thank you all for a fascinating panel. It's stimulated a lot of questions, and I'll just make a couple. This goes back to the issue of litigation. I know from sort of other kinds of cases that for instance, anti-tobacco litigation and so on, that you find sort of coordination between sort of individual litigants. You have people sort of coordinating and learning across systematically in order to create precisely more effect and more implementation. Is this also happening with this type of litigation? Do different groups and individuals, are there anybody coordinating, learning within states, across states? So that's one question. And related, what about the international environment? Are there international collaboration on this? Is there any learning from what's happening elsewhere? Could you say something about that? And also related, to what extent is this sort of is litigation embedded in other forms of social mobilization around the issues? You were saying something about that, but more generally, is this something that sort of, you said, this is basically lawyers taking the case to the court on their own, it doesn't incur much cost, but that is also maybe making it difficult to sort of sustain pressure over the long term. So what are the efforts to sort of strategically use litigation as part of a broader and more sustained mobilization in these different areas? So that's one complex that I'd like views on. And then just to the issue of land title, I mean, I know from the discussions elsewhere, of course, that there has been a lot of criticism. You were discussing it briefly, but on land titling also sort of having the adverse effects of creating landlessness, partly because of more or less forced or coerced or tricked sale of, if you own something, you can hand it off. And of course, not all titles can be handed or sold, but so that's one question. But also over time, I mean, not everybody in the community will then have the titles. Some families will have, and some people will have titles, others will not. And which means that the traditional network may be or maybe not, serving the purpose of a safety net in these societies will be under pressure. Is this something that sort of you're seeing, and is that happening more in some contexts? Thank you.
It has the parallel in Meghalaya. Exactly.
Yeah, no, this is not only for Gujarat. I'm sort of thinking more generally of these questions, actually, but they came to my mind now.
Panel answers. Maybe we'll take one or two more questions. So, Spandana.
Thank you so much to the panel for enlightening us with their experiences today. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing their experiences. My question sort of goes to Ms. Kohli. This is sort of related to what Mr. Ravi had said about how in tribal areas there are a lot of like communal disputes because of lack of clear-cut demarcations of lands. So I just want to, I'm asking you especially because of the work that you do with Namati, that this is something, you know, I want to move away from litigation, and I want to ask you what kind of community level alternate dispute resolutions that have come out or that you've seen, do they exist? And if not, are there organizations which are sort of like getting into communities and sort of trying to mediate or negotiate between parties? Yeah, just if you could throw some light on that.
To answer to your first question, a lot of groups, informal coordinations are across, at least in India, on the Forest Rights Act only there are 2 or 3 groups that are working in coordination. So information sharing is very fast between groups from one state to another state. That is happening. Not necessarily coordinated action every time. Mainly it restricts because it depends, finally it depends on the groups working in a particular state where they have to figure out when to take up an issue and how to take up an issue. But certain national common concerns are raised at Delhi level, at other levels, at state level. In Gujarat, we have a coordination of about 40 groups working in tribal areas, which are working in close coordination. So everything we are doing, taking actions, we are taking this petition PIL which we filed, that was also part of that overall close coordination which we are working at. So that type of things. With international NGOs, I don't know about with right now, none of the groups I know, none of them have any. Maybe Culfrix having something with some in international NGO, but otherwise I don't know anybody having any. That's the thing. Other question.
One thing that Amrish left out, that because of they have this case, this FRA was not their first PIL. They have been involved in court cases for at least 2 decades, and his wife, who was otherwise already working, thought of becoming a lawyer herself so that she can take forward the cases more effectively. But I think, and the judgment, this FRA judgment, I myself may have shared it to at least 100 people, across different states who wanted to get the copy of the Gujarat judgment and its summaries in India. On the international, I can just tell you my personal experience recently on this issue of mineral rights. There's been this whole thing about natural gas in the US, a virtual revolution that has taken place. What to me struck as really interesting and powerful is that the natural gas revolution in the United States in the last 5 years has taken place mostly on private agricultural land, which means that unlike the Alaska issue where the federal government can stop a pipeline or whatever, here the private farmers directly negotiated with the explorers and the oil companies. And the technology has evolved to such an extent that the farmers continue to farm on the land, and the drilling today is vertical and horizontal. So you don't disrupt a lot of land on top. And they get a royalty, which goes directly to the landowner. So to me, the reason why I think law may be important, but it's not cast in stone. If society is aware and moves, the law will get changed. And therefore, I'm not so concerned that there are a lot of restrictions on the law, FRA, because I'm not looking for an ideal law. I'm looking for just one more step from where we were. And the next step will follow. Inevitably, it will follow. So we should look at law as a part of the evolution and not a final state given by somebody. Because this is an evolutionary state, and I can tell you, the inability to transfer is not just protecting the tribals. It's also undermining the price and creating local mafia. That is, local power lords, brokers, take over on Benami land from their peers in the community and then take it out, become a sleeping partner with an outside investor. So the corruption is not just one way in terms of the poor farmer or tribal losing out. Restriction itself creates its own cost, and people will have to resolve it. But we are not getting into that because the whole focus has been, let's get this one step going before we come to the other issues.
I'll try and do two quick responses to your two questions and then to the final one. I think a lot of people who are litigating are also part of social mobilizations. So, which is not unique to India. It's pretty much the case everywhere else. So I think that so in many ways, when social movement groups tend to coordinate amongst each other, there are people who have been helping with litigation and who've been part of those processes. They tend to these lines kind of get blurred because each one comes with their own role. So I think that it's pretty integrated. There is increasing international cooperation, including international groups supporting litigation indirectly, etc. That is going on pretty much. So I mean, it kind of all the 3 points tend to get merged. The whole issue of land titles and creating landlessness, I think, is definitely a very clear thought process that has gone on. What happens post the Forest Rights Act? Can actually rights be acquired? How much can it really mobilize? All those kinds of concerns have been raised, even in areas where Forest Rights Act has been used as a mechanism of assertion. We say, it'll give you something to be able to negotiate better when there was nothing more. So I mean, it is the flip side. It can happen. I mean, in fact, recording of rights can immediately mean you know exactly what land is where and what you can acquire, what you can take. I think Bharat Bhai will be in a much better position to answer the question about are there existing alternate dispute resolution mechanisms. My understanding is that there are, but there are mostly in relation to the livelihoods that are prevailing currently there. So, for instance, if you have to, if there's a dispute between a salt pan worker and the fishing community, between the grazing community and the fishing community or the agriculturists, there are alternate dispute resolution mechanisms there. When it's the external, when it's an Adani or an OPG or a Tata Power which comes in, I'm not sure the alternate dispute resolution mechanism, or rather I don't think they work. In terms of Namati, Namati in India is not working on alternate dispute resolution mechanism. We are looking at more environment justice and enforcement issues.
I had two quick questions. One was on dispute resolution, or more on community engagement. I would like to ask the panel if they have come across any successful model of community engagement, either due to pressure or from the people or from the government itself, of private organizations involving in good community engagement or sort of good community engagement. And the second question was to the panel and to everyone at large about what are your views on private ownership of resources? Because from what I understand in the Meghalaya panel and the little bit of experience that we had when we had gone there, was one of the reasons of one of the bigger problems of rat hole mining is also because it is private land, privately owned resources, and there have been very little restrictions over there. Similarly, with the shale gas revolution as well, because it was on private land, the government could not intervene for a very long time in terms of the regulations and rules and on environmental impacts. And the only time they did was when there were large-scale negative implications which were very obviously visible. So in that sense, what does the panel think about private right to minerals and resources, and how can individual ownership of resources under the land curb a mafia of any sort still developing, or misuse of the resources and the way they are mined and excavated? Thank you.
Isn't that what you're supposed to find out after 3 years?
Should we take another question?
My question to the panel is, like, we come to hear about mostly about PILs with respect to environment law and stuff. So my question is, to what extent this PIL thing is effective for resolving all these disputes and issues?
Yeah, I'll just say on the mineral thing. I personally think it should, under the ground goes to the landowner. And the rest would be taken, I think the Meghalaya, I don't know much about it, but I think there would be environmental costs in many such activities. And it will be up to the community themselves to negotiate to resolve their dispute. And in our case, we have seen the 50,000 plots that have been mapped by Archvahini and that network in Gujarat. There is not one instance so far where the community has not resolved boundary disputes. Given the prospect, recognizing and accepting their capacity to strike a deal in good faith is very high, much higher than most of us would have believed from the outside.
I personally disagree with Mr. Itra on this. So, with respect to mineral resources under the soil, different countries have different legal regimes regulating that. The US gives the landowner the right to mineral resources under the soil. Germany does not. The British state in India, that was the arrangement that they established. And I do think that. I think that obviously different countries have different kinds of social and political circumstances, so you can't really look at them like that. I do think that in developing countries that have scarce resources, and I think that maybe that's the question also I would put to the panel, is that we've heard a variety of views here, but the fact of the matter is that there are some views that haven't come out in this discussion, and that's a very vocal lobby which is out there, which is the industrial lobby, private capital, and so on. And wherever you have scarce resources, if you would give rights over those resources to a select group of people, landowners, I think it would not work out very well for the social good, and would also create regulatory challenges of the kinds that we've heard about in Meghalaya. So I'm not sure that the rights to mineral resources under the soil should belong to landowners, especially when land titles and land records themselves are not clear. There's been so much displacement of people who legitimately did own the land and so on. So that's my personal view on that. But I think that the other question that I hope we can all think about is that how do we resolve, so there's even with respect to the Forest Rights Act, we have the conservationist lobby, which we haven't really heard about, here, and their interests. And then, of course, there's been a lot of criticism that because it's set, and obviously you have to set because you set this 2005 cutoff date, you basically, took away the rights of those who moved after 2005, because any date is arbitrary in that sense. So in any situation, I think that there are multiple layers and conflicting interests even within those. You're empowering one community and you might be disempowering another, even through an enabling law like the Forest Rights Act. And I think with the fisher folk, there's also at the national level, there's a Fishing Rights Act that was being sort of thought about and pushed. I don't know if you want to talk about that. And I find it interesting that this we have a significant rightsification of our discourse today, where everything is every claim is sort of articulated in the form of a right, which kind of talks again to the judicialization of and of the way we articulate our claims, not as in terms of sort of community activities that you were talking about, more in terms of assertion of a legal right that you can then effectuate. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well. You can have some concluding observations on that and then break for lunch. Yeah.
One couple of points only. As far as this mineral rights on individual lands and versus common, I think this is in a way, not a very fertile debate, because most of our mineral resources are in any case under government lands. Most of the government, so it is all government lands. The question, more appropriate question is whether the local communities should have a say in the use or extraction of the resources, and how much say and how much royalty they should have. So that is the biggest question. Right now, they don't have any say. It is all central government. And whatever extraction takes place, they are at the receiving end of all the negative impacts, and they don't have any benefit from the income that the government accrues from that. So the ownership of the Gram Sabhas, ownership, not ownership, or say stake, a higher stake. And if with higher stake also, some Gram Sabhas would feel that we don't want our resources to be extracted. So respect that. But right now, when they don't get anything, so they would say all the time, no. If they have a choice, they would say, don't do this, because in any case, they are not getting anything. If they have a stake, then if they say no, then they would be paying a price of foregone benefits. So they would have an interest to calculate whether benefit cost is proper or not, and whether to do these things in a proper way. But I do believe that...
I think there are two different things though, right? Consulting the local communities in terms of exploitation
and
of the
giving them
resources.
an important say, because there are these Niyamgiri hills. If the tribals believe that we don't want our hills to be extracted, that right also must be respected. You can't just impose your decision, which are in the so-called national interest, on these tribals. So that is all. So you give the local tribals, local communities a stake, and there would be, in certain areas, tribals would want to go ahead with them. And because they are local, they know the impact of everything that is happening there, they can have better safeguards. Although their bargaining power vis-a-vis industries and other companies would be less. So there can be a role of government involvement in that. But giving them a right to say no. So same with Land Acquisition Act. Land Acquisition Act saying no right remains. Why should you acquire compulsorily for land, for industries, and for even township developments? In Kutch, most of the industrialization that is going on, apart from coastal areas, it is mostly on government lands, say Mudra and other things. But all private lands also, the farmers have negotiated straight with the industries. No Land Acquisition Act. That is the reason why Gujarat does not have many protests against Land Acquisition Act. Although government land is being gifted away in a most brazen manner, but you don't have, private land is not being acquired compulsorily. So that issue
Except
also.
for the common property resources.
Common property resources, and there are individuals who are already using those common resources for fisheries, for agriculture, for other things, and all their rights are being nullified, and just private interest together with state power are doing all these things.
I'll just try and respond to 2 points. One on the how effective are PILs. I think there's a lot that goes around the final. I mean, what is the final outcome of a PIL is actually determined by many other factors than what really goes on in court. And I think any one of us who's been part of those dynamics, how positions change. What are the kinds of arguments that are put forward? I think the effectiveness is in terms of an environmental outcome. I think is there are many more factors that influence it than just an issue of law. I think that's so. I think it's a whole area of research and debate which needs to be opened up on that. The other thing is about our private organizations taking on any private. By private, I'm presuming you're meaning industrial and infrastructure projects, doing any good community practice. If you start with the issue of breakdown of social relationships and ecological change, takeover and land use change, then good would really depend on what you consider to be a good life, right? So it's if from an environmental point of view, change of an ecological, a place like Kutch where the socio-ecological ethos continues to exist right now, if it's perceived as good, then the land use change will not be good. However, if you perceive as a good process of law that is followed, where people feel engaged and part of a process, that could be considered good. Or a good compensation package could be considered good. So I think in many cases, from my experience, I think the good practice is in the final block, where it's good compensation packages that is beginning to emerge, which is also being demanded. In the few instances where it is good, you get good financial gains, at least for a few people who are being impacted. Yeah.
So I'm afraid we are out of time. So I'll just take this opportunity to thank all the panelists. And I think that many of the issues that have come up are going to be continued in the Andhra panel. And there's been such a lively discussion. So there's going to be, especially on land acquisition, I think Pawan will have things to say about that. And I'm sure Dr. Shastri and Ravi will continue to, we'll talk about these issues. So please, I'd like to invite you all for lunch now, and then we'll be back in about 45 minutes. And yeah, so around 3 o'clock, and then we'll have the session on Andhra and continue these discussions. Thank you very much.